Let your conscience be your guide. Now, we've probably all heard that. It's something we hear both out there in the world as well as within Christianity. And within certain parameters, the conscience can be a guide. But it also has some problems, potentially. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we are trying to answer the question, what is man? And we are moving from having looked at the spirit and the soul and the mind and the heart to now moving into the conscience. Now, I don't think the conscience is something altogether different than the heart or the mind or anything. It's a word that's going to be talking about how we reckon with the information that we have, how we look at things out there in the world. And so we're going to see in Romans chapter 2 that Paul's going to give us a little bit of an illustration of what the conscience does. In verse 14 of Romans 2, and Paul in the first 3 chapters is going through different people throughout history and different people groups in terms of not everybody was under the law, not everybody had these relationships, demonstrating that everybody's equally lost. He's not showing how anybody gets saved. He's showing how everybody is equally lost. And he's talking here to Jews that take their pride in the law and think that we have the law and we're teachers of these others. But he says in verse 14, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law, and it's when they don't have that law, they instinctively, he says, those then by nature, they're doing the things of the law. So this would be the things that you would find in the law. These they're not having law. It's just law. He says they don't have law of any sort, really, in terms of the Mosaic law. They are a law unto themselves. Now, where did they get this law? They get it from their culture. Their culture teaches them things. Their parents taught them things. The people around them are saying, this is what's expected of you. This is how you ought to react, how you ought to act. These are the kind of things that go on when we're talking about the law and what it does. And so Paul is saying these people that don't have law, they have a sort of law, and he's trying to help the Jews understand that. And he says that in its verse 15 that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. And I don't believe this is God coming down and writing the principles of the law, the 10 Commandments, or any of that kind of stuff in their hearts. It's the fact that all cultures to some degree have some sense of what's right and wrong. Now, I read a history a number of years ago about some explorers, and they stayed with a group of indigenous people that just knocked themselves out, really took care of them, were wonderful. They moved on and on down their journey a little ways. They stayed with another group of people, and those people did nothing but steal from them left and right. It was a chronic problem because it was part of that culture. We would look at that and say a culture that teaches people to steal, that's got a problem. But there's all kinds of things that cultures teach people how to fit in within their particular culture, and it's directly related to this law written in their hearts, and it's being written in their hearts by their parents, by the people that they spend time with, by the government and the culture at large. And as a result, then their conscience, and this will be important when we look at what the word conscience means in a bit, it then does one of two things. When they have this law written in their hearts, it then bears witness along with this law, or it's using the law, to bear witness with their logical reasonings, and it's doing then two things. It is either between them, accusing them, or defending them, or excusing them, I think we used to have in the old authorized version. In other words, when they function based on this law written in their hearts that their mom and dads taught them, they either have a good conscience and they're like, hey, things are good, or they have a bad conscience and they're like, bad. And if you're in a culture that teaches you not to steal, when you don't steal and there's an opportunity and you'd like to, but you don't, you go, hey, that's good. But if you're in a culture that teaches you to steal, and you could have, but you are afraid of really getting in trouble from somebody, maybe somebody doing harm for stealing, and then you don't steal, your conscience is going, oh, you worthless, you didn't do your part. And so this is an illustration how different cultures and such this law written in their hearts is not the Mosaic law, but it's what the culture is teaching them. And I think that this is important. Now, all of this then comes down to, what does this word conscience mean? And if you look at just the English word here, if you're not familiar with the composition of this particular English word, the first part of it, has this idea of together. And then science, if you don't know what science is knowledge. It's literally, we use science today of other things, but the word technically just meant to have knowledge. So it was knowledge with, or with knowledge. Let's take a look at the word. Here's our word sun oida, to with knowledge, or with knowing, we might say. And then sun eidesis, here's our word for the conscience. And sun eidesis, you can see the pronunciation, and it's with knowledge. So here's our verb, I know, and here's the word to have a conscience. Really it's the same thing, one's just a verb, one's a noun. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something with knowledge. In other words, what is it? You are, by your parents, with people, you're given knowledge. That knowledge teaches you about certain things. And when you act in keeping with the knowledge that you've been trained with, then you have a good conscience. When you act out of keeping, when you act contrary to the knowledge that you were taught, when you have to push against what you were trained with. Think of that especially. Many people, they may come to think differently than their parents thought about certain things. But even in the process of doing that, they have conscience problems, because there's kind of back here in the back of their mind, there's a little bit of a sense of guilt going, but this is not the way my parents raised me. This is not how I was trained to think. And so they have a conscience problem. One of my friends pictured the conscience like a set of balance scales. You've got knowledge and you've got activity, something you're doing or others are doing. And when that activity and the knowledge match, you have the balance scales are good. But if your activity does not match what you know, then the balance scales are out of whack. And you have a conscience problem. Now, I want to see that the conscience of itself is not particularly foolproof. And we'll come back to this passage because I think it's very important. But Paul is talking about being judged by the Corinthians, being judged by people. And in verse 4, in fact, Paul says at the end, I don't even judge myself. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And then verse 4, for I am conscious, this is one of the places that the verb occurs, I am conscious of nothing against myself. In other words, Paul says, I can't think of anything in which my knowledge is out of whack with my actions. As far as I'm concerned, they match when he's writing the Corinthians. I've done these things in keeping with what I know. Yet he says, yet I am not by this, and they have acquitted. Literally, I'm not, we have a form of the word, I'm not one that has been settled, declared righteous with regard to his actions, is what he's talking about. He is righteous before God, but he's talking about being okay in his actions. But the one who examines me is the Lord, and therefore he says, you shouldn't be going around trying to judge everything that everybody does as though you can figure out their motives. You are called to judge some things, but you don't go around judging people's motives because you don't know what's going on in their heart. And that's what this issue is about. It's not just judging actions of itself. But the conscious problem, what Paul's saying here is, I'm conscious. My conscience is good. Paul's going, I got a good conscience. And I've had people say that to me. You're like, and they go, I got a clear conscience on this. And I said, just because you got a clear conscience doesn't mean that it's right. Doesn't mean that God's okay with it. Because we can have a clear conscience of things because, well, we think it's just the best thing for me. It's the best thing for my family. It's the best for this, even though I know God says this, but if I do that, it's certainly going to be this, like this. We always have this played out in our mind, how a thing's going to turn out, and we don't know how it will turn out. So just because your conscience is clear does not mean before you God, you stand righteous in that activity. You get the point? So the conscience isn't a foolproof guide. Now I want to go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and just give an illustration of this at work. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 4. Therefore concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols. This is an issue in Corinth, and it's an issue when Paul writes Romans. We know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world. Well, there are idols, but what he says, that there is no God but one. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, or indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, even the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. So in other words, he says, we look at these idols out there, and if you know something as a Christian, you realize those idols really in the end are nothing, because there is no real God that stands behind those, because there is only one God. And in this context, he distinguishes God as the Father and God as the Son. So he refers to Jesus Christ as Lord, which I believe is a reference to his deity in here. But the point being is, there's really only one. Therefore, the eating of things offered to idols really shouldn't be an issue. But, having said that, verse 7, however, not all have this knowledge. And men is not even here. It's just literally, it's just all. Not all have this knowledge. In other words, there are some people that still, maybe because they participated in the idolatry in the city of Corinth, and they worship these idols, and they look at that idol, and it's something to them. And so he says, but not all have the knowledge that in reality that idol really is nothing. They've believed in Jesus Christ. They know the one true God, but what's with this thing I used to bow down to? And some then being accustomed, or they have a custom with, a habit with this thing to the idol until now. They eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. In other words, they have knowledge of this idol that they sacrifice to. They have knowledge now that they are a believer in Jesus Christ, and if they step over here and eat meat offered to idol, to them, that conscience, the balance scales are out of whack, and they are, I shouldn't have done that because I'm worshiping this God, even though Paul's saying, no, you're not really worshiping that God. But in their mind it is, because they have an experience with this false god, with this idol that they had gone to. And so they have a conscience problem. You see this? It's a very real example. And we could say that with lots of situations that believers come into. There's many things out here in the world that as believers we can do. But some believers, their life before they were saved really involved certain activities that are okay to a limited degree, but now that they're saved, they do nothing but associate that with the way they used to live, and they have a conscience problem that I can't do that anymore. And so if they see somebody else doing that thing, it causes a problem. I'll give you another example. This is one that's maybe easy for us to get, but here's one that maybe is a lot more sensitive and among a lot of believers. The Bible does not prohibit you and I from drinking alcoholic beverage. What it tells us not to do is to become drunk, which really means a lot of moderation, because just plain and simple, a lot of believers are drunk, or people, I should say. A lot of people are drunk and they don't realize they're drunk. It doesn't take much to actually raise the blood above what the government says is okay. Anyway, that aside, if they associate with their pre-saved life, and so I go, well, it's okay for me, and so I'm around them, and I go ahead and drink, and they see my actions doing this, their conscience has a problem, because they're going, oh, you're doing that horrible thing that I used to do before I was saved. And they have a conscience problem, because my actions are saying something to how they think. You get that idea? Or maybe they're going, well, Tim's doing it, so I'll do it. I'll join in, but I shouldn't, because all this was bad. This is the way I used to behave. And now they have a conscience problem because their actions don't match what they know. It could be my actions, it could be theirs. But their conscience being weak is defiled. That's an issue. And he goes on and talks about this down here, but it's because they have knowledge, something that they were trained with, now maybe as a believer or just in life, And that knowledge then has to be weighed against actions, my actions, their actions, whatever it might be, to say, I'm okay, I'm not okay. And this is what the conscience is doing. We'll come back and we'll look at a couple more examples. I don't think that this isn't a terribly hard concept to get, but I think maybe a couple of other texts will be helpful before we move on, just to think about the limits of a conscience and why we should pursue a good conscience. But in the end, a good conscience doesn't necessarily mean that everything's okay. Because as Paul said, just because my conscience is good, that doesn't mean that I'm right in that matter. Now, I trust, as you live these things, as you relate to who you are in Christ, that you can have a good conscience, that you can say, this is who God says I am, and I want my life to conform to or match who I am in Christ. That would be something that would balance out your conscience as a practical application of this. And with that, thank you for joining me today.